I'm Katie Bennett-Stenton, a senior B2B marketer with 20 years experience across the UK, United States and Asia Pacific. Last year, I was fortunate to spend 3 months with Deloitte in Chicago. During that time, I was delighted to have the opportunity to spend time with a number of global experts. Throughout that period, I interviewed a range of leaders and shared their thought-provoking, relevant and influential takeaways weekly. Now that I'm back in Melbourne, the Katie Talks conversation with influencers continues. And today's is fantastic. In framing it up, I read a great quote recently that today's MI6 chief has revealed that he searched specifically for recruits who do not shout loud and show off, but have had to fight to get on in life. And I feel that that frames today's influencer really, really nicely. Megumi Miki is the founder of Quietly Powerful. She's an author, a speaker, and a facilitator in leadership, culture, and diversity. Megumi, welcome.
Thank you, Katie. It's lovely to be here.
It's great to be speaking to you today. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Before we get underway, Megumi, perhaps you could just share a little bit about your background, please.
Sure. I am Japanese by background, in case people don't realise from my name. And I am Australian, though, as I'm sure people can hear in my accent. But I have to say my taste buds are still very Japanese, but apart from that, I'm very Australian. And I have been working in Australia for, 20-odd years now. It's a bit scary to say, but my career's been spanning across management consulting to begin with. I worked in strategy consulting for quite some time in Anderson Consulting in the old days, now called Accenture. I also worked at ANZ doing cultural change work as an internal facilitator and consultant, which was a fantastic period of time. And then I also worked at NAB and some other smaller firms. And then now for the last 7 years, I've been working as an independent consultant, so with my own business, and Quietly Powerful is one part of that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Megumi. The title of your first book is Start Inspiring, Stop Driving. I'm interested to hear more about that. We hear lots about driving initiatives at work, drive change, drive culture, drive results. We hear it every day. I'm interested to understand more. Are we in a transition? Talk me through this.
Sure. I just thought about this whole word drive, and I think we just use it as a habit, but also with a bit of an energy. Like if you think about the word drive, do you get a sense that it's like pushing and you're in charge and that kind of thing? Do you get that sense?
Yeah, yes, I would say I do.
Yeah. So I thought when I think about the word drive, like even driving, you drive a car, and the more you do the driving, the more passengers you create is kind of the image that I had. And if you're trying to deliver a result or create some change and you're creating more passengers, my concern is that people aren't really going to be taking ownership and taking initiative to create that result or the change. So that's what I was trying to challenge, that when leaders are at the front and trying to drive change and drive everything, then you're not really instilling ownership in people and creating what you really want is everybody taking ownership and driving together, if you like. So I want the teams to be driving it, not the leader. So that's why I was thinking if you can start inspiring teams to take that ownership, that would be a much better approach to delivering results and change.
Well, and it sounds like from what you're talking about, this is a way of working that has everybody having more ownership with something that is with a strategy or something that's being delivered rather than one person with overall responsibility.
Yeah, well, you can still have the responsibility, but if you are the one directing and telling people what to do, then I don't think you get the best results. And as I said, ownership is a key element of change, and you can't keep on driving. You can't tell people to take ownership, I don't think, because ownership is a feeling. You can tell them all you like, but if they don't feel like they can own it, then that doesn't happen.
It's such an interesting and confronting concept, Megumi, because as I said when I was sort of asking the questions, drive
Mm,
is just a word we hear used in so many different contexts, both professionally and
mm,
personally. So, hearing that description sort of caused me to really sit back and sort of think quite deeply
mm,
about this language that we use.
mm. Yeah, and I think it's a habit in a way that like everybody uses it, like you said, and
Mm.
so we don't really think about the not just the meaning behind it, but the energy that comes with that word, and that's what I was trying to change and challenge, because inspiring to me has a much more pull rather than a push to it, and so people want to create the change or deliver results rather than somebody telling you to, and I think that's a very different energy.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that's really poignant. I'm really pleased to be exploring this issue as someone who is definitely an extrovert. I'm interested to understand more about your background and how you got to where you are.
Sure. So the whole idea of quietly powerful came about, one, because of course I'm an introvert, but also I've always been a quieter child anyway, amongst Japanese people. And you can imagine Japanese people are generally slightly quieter than Western people. Um,
Yes.
yeah, I was always told that I was this quiet child, and I'm the baby of the family. I'm the younger of two sisters, and yeah, my mum used to talk on my behalf because I wouldn't say things, and that was fine for me. It was easy for me because I just sat back and watched everybody else talk, and
Hmm.
but I suppose as I grew up and went into working life, that didn't work so well for me. So I did realise that I needed to be a little bit more vocal, and starting off in management consulting was probably a bit of a shock to the system because everybody looked really confident and they were
Sure.
very vocal, whether they were, new into the organisation or new to clients. You almost had to have that air of confidence, and
Hmm.
I certainly didn't feel that way. And I suppose I learnt to get by, and I tried to learn everything I can, so I knew what I was talking about. Um, Although as a 20-something-year-old, I always felt like I didn't know enough. Um,
Sure.
yeah, it was tough going, but I did okay, but I just burnt myself out actually. And so after finishing up with consulting, I moved on to ANZ, and ANZ was a really great place to be in that I first started off in finance and performance analysis type of area,
Hmm.
which is really where my expertise was, in the strategy and performance analysis type of area. So very analytical. But then while I was there, ANZ was going through a major cultural change program called Breakout. And it was very well known at the time. This was in the early 2000s. And I went to this 3-day workshop with the Breakout team, or the Breakout program. And I was just blown away by what I didn't know. And what I didn't know was about the human side of business, and also the personal development that's required to be a good leader and to create a great culture in organisations. So I was just blown away and decided that I really want to invest in that side for myself personally. But then about a month after I went on the workshop, they advertised for internal facilitators to join the team. And I said, oh, me. So I put my hand up. And even though I had no background in it, I had a go at applying. And I still pinched myself. I managed to get appointed into the internal facilitator role. So that was the beginning of my leadership and culture work and training and learning, which was fantastic.
That
So from there, yeah, I moved into doing leadership and culture work, and I spent 7 or 8 years at ANZ learning about all of this. And since then, I've been working in that field, working at NAB, and then doing my own thing.
That's so interesting. I mean, the opportunity to have a 3-day training program and for that to significantly reframe many elements of how you thought about, well, yourself and
Mm,
your profession such that it set you
mm,
up for another career or a real change in focus really interesting.
Yeah, no, it was a 180-degree turn in my career, and it was actually a very difficult transition in the sense that, you know, I didn't really have a background in it, so I had to learn from scratch. But it was so rewarding. It was hard, but it was very rewarding. But the other thing is, it was hard because the people who were appointed as the internal facilitators, most of them were extroverts, and so it was really tough going for me to really know how to be as a leadership consultant and facilitator without too many models around me. So in some ways, that was part of my reasoning behind doing Quietly Powerful as well, because I didn't see enough role models who I could emulate, and because I struggled, I just thought if I can share some of my learnings, that might help other people as well. So that's certainly the background to the Quietly Powerful work too.
I find that so interesting. When we spoke ahead of recording, you talked about a really powerful moment that you still reflect back on when you were presenting and when a colleague came up and talked to you. I'd love it if you'd be happy to share that story, please.
Yeah. So the insight really came, and I suppose that was the first seed of thinking I really need to work on this idea called Quietly Powerful, and that was when this was quite a bit after. So after I learnt all the facilitation, so I was reasonable at it already, but I was co-facilitating with a colleague who was the opposite end of myself in terms of energy and extroversion. So he's a fantastic facilitator who's like the one with the gift of the gab, and he's very entertaining, and he's got a big energy, and he can engage a group in an instant, that kind of person. And he was kicking off the workshop, and it was very engaging, and people were laughing in the first 2 seconds. It was a great start to the workshop. And I was enjoying it until it got a little bit closer to the time that it was my turn to stand up and do my bit. I was starting to have a little voice in my head going, oh my God, these people are so engaged and laughing, and I don't do that sort of thing. I'm not as funny. I don't engage people like he does. And, what if they disengage, and what if they get bored with me? So I was having all these little chatters in my head and getting a bit concerned, and I got up and did my thing, and it was fine. There was nothing wrong with it. But while we went into the break, I had a person who I knew quite well in the group, and she came up to me during the break and said, Megumi, you're not quite yourself. What's going on? And I explained to her what was going on with this internal dialogue I was having, and she just looked at me in the face and said to me, "Oh, Megumi, just stop having those comparison chatters, because the fact that the two of you are so different is what brings value to the group. Just stop telling yourself that you should be like him." And so that was a real, if you like, a smack in the face, in that I intellectually knew that.
Yes.
But it was really that moment that somebody else told me, and also told me the impact of myself comparing with other people, that really got me thinking and feeling that I needed to work on appreciating what I brought that was different to other people. So that was a real penny dropping moment for me.
I love hearing stories like this. I mean, that was a good few years ago, and the fact that you can still recount it in such vivid detail is quite extraordinary. I mean, is this imposter syndrome that we're talking about, do you think? Is there an element of that?
There was definitely an element of that. And imposter syndrome's been around for a long time for me. Like, even in the strategy consulting days, I think I mentioned earlier that I didn't feel like I knew enough, and I didn't feel like I was good enough. And being a younger person in my 20s and meeting clients who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and mostly male, of course.
Yes, of course.
was not an easy thing to do, because I always thought that I might get found out I don't know anything. So that was around all the time. So I worked extra hard to make sure that I knew my stuff. But then in this field of leadership consulting and facilitation, as hard as I worked, I couldn't become an extrovert. So
Well, no, it's not who you
it
are.
wasn't really one that I could. I couldn't. Yeah, I couldn't copy somebody and become them.
Yeah.
So and even though at times I really tried, when I did, people would tell me that I wasn't being myself. So
Sure.
I couldn't win. I felt like I needed to be like them, but I couldn't. And even when I tried, people thought that I was faking it. So yeah, I couldn't win.
Well, thank goodness you settled upon the sort of career where you can be completely authentic and still add massive value to people's lives.
Yeah. Well, lucky I realised, but it took me a very long time to realise though. So,
Yeah,
so which
sure.
is why I suppose I'm wanting to share with people. Don't wait till you're 40 something to realise that you can be yourself.
I mean, there's a lot of talk about authenticity these days, but I think
Yeah.
this is a really interesting and different slant on that compared to what I have heard or read about before. So I'm really grateful with you sharing your extensive expertise around this. Megumi, you've had a really interesting career, which, as you mentioned earlier, included some time with Anderson Consulting, and where ultimately you experienced burnout. And burnout is something that comes up time and again in my podcasts. It's something that I've experienced and a number of my interviewees have. And I get a lot of feedback from people, from listeners, keen to talk about it some more, and in hushed tones. They almost whisper about it because it seems that there's this real taboo in talking about it. I'd love to hear about a little bit more about your experience and I guess even more critically, what you learned as a result of that.
I read recently that the World Health Organization has now put it into one of their documents as an official problem. So it's a serious issue.
It is.
And I suppose for me, the burnout came from a number of sources, and I suppose one of them was the imposter syndrome that we just talked about. Sure. That I felt like I really wasn't good enough and didn't know enough, and therefore I worked so hard to know what I could, and that meant putting in very long hours. And I mean, at times, I remember one project. It was one of my favourite projects. So it was kind of a mix of I really wanted to do well and as well as an imposter syndrome combined together. So that's a recipe for burnout. But it was one of those projects that I really enjoyed, and I liked the client, and I really wanted to do my best. And so I worked so hard where I would work till like 2 or 3 in the morning, and my client was an early starter, so we'd have meetings at 6:30 in the morning. So it was just crazy. I had 2 or 3 hours of sleep, if that, a night at times, and I was still in my 20s, so obviously I could recover a lot better than I could now, but still I found that I just burnt out. So the moment that I realised I burnt out was when I was working on a project in Brisbane, and I had a bit of a cold, and I used to get colds every 2 months or so, so that was a sign as well. But in Brisbane, I was doing this project, I was working late, and I had a team who was also working really long hours, but there was a final presentation I was about to do to the client, and the day before the presentation, I lost my voice. Oh. I was thinking, no, I have to present tomorrow and I don't have a voice. So that night I was just in tears going, this is not working for me. And, I just felt that I really seriously burnt out. So I suppose the lesson that I took away from that is, one, it's not worth that.
Yes.
If you can't look after yourself, if you don't look after yourself, you can't do the things that you want to do. So I wanted to do a good job of that client presentation, but obviously it was very difficult to do.
Sure. So
I think it's that whole thing about, those masks on planes, help yourself first before you can help other people. So that was probably one big lesson for me. So I do prioritize looking after myself more now.
Okay.
So so that's certainly been something that has been a lesson for me.
Yeah, well, I certainly relate to that. I for a long time would get up early at sort of 5:36 and go for a run, get little people off to school and daycare, work a big job, come home and burn the candle well and truly at both ends with a, stressful job and busy life, and ended up having a virus that was very similar to chronic fatigue, and basically spent 3 months in bed.
Gee.
And that was really confronting, because before that I had considered myself to be entirely bulletproof. People had often commented on my being high energy, and I think I previously equated that to working all hours of the day, and being in a condition where I could run a half marathon, and being someone who would enjoy some lovely dinners with people, and it made me fundamentally reassess the way that that I look after myself, and I've made a whole lot of changes from that.
Yeah,
but it's
fantastic.
surprising how many people have had similar experiences.
Yeah, and in some ways, until you experience that burnout, or at least signs of burnout, it's hard to realise that you're not invincible.
Yes.
Isn't it? Especially when you're younger too, when you're in your 20s
indeed.
and 30s, you think that you can keep going.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I feel like that's something I could talk ad nauseum about. Yes, long
for sure.
learning curve.
Yeah, and the other thing too with the whole burnout thing, because it's become such an issue, that's one of the things that I talk about with Quietly Powerful too, in that it's not just about introverts. It's actually everybody needs some quiet and peace and quiet in their lives, that they have some, and I'm sure yourself as an extrovert, you like to socialize and everything else, but you do need some time on your own. And I think that is something that we might be overlooking a bit. That we all say that human beings are social beings, and I agree with that, but I think human beings are also solitary as well, that we need a bit of both, that's socializing and solitude.
I would agree with that, and from a personal perspective, I'm finding more and more that it's that quiet time on my own that also helps to re-energize me. I mean, I certainly get energy from being around other people, but increasingly I do find it's that quiet, reflective downtime that is really critical.
Yeah, well, there are some research to say that your brain cells regenerate in quiet time. So you do need solitude.
Okay.
Like the human brain actually needs it. So so meditation's certainly been part of my life since doing all the leadership work. So I've been meditating probably now for 18 years.
Wow.
And,
okay.
It's absolutely essential for me. Otherwise, I don't function properly.
So interesting how we all have this journey learning different elements about what works well for us.
Definitely.
When you moved to ANZ and started focusing a lot more around personal leadership and cultural change, it sounds like you had a lot of change in terms of how you thought about your career and professional life. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Sure. So when I went to this 3-day workshop that I mentioned earlier, what was very obvious to me was that I was having a career and doing strategy and finance and all of those things because I thought that was the right thing to do based on other people's expectations. So that was a big insight for me, and in fact it was quite an emotional insight for me that I was running my life based on other people's expectations. What I realized was I had completely disconnected from what I loved and I was passionate about. And so when I found it, it was like, oh my God, I can't believe I found what I'm passionate about. So it was such an eye-opener to be able to commit myself fully into something that I really believed in, that's something that I was passionate about, and it was about connecting with myself, but it was also helping other people to connect with themselves as well. And I think that's been very much my journey. So it wasn't just about connecting with the work that I love, but also just connecting with myself and who I am. So that's been pretty much my life and career journey. So I do acknowledge and appreciate the time I had at ANZ, because that was really the beginnings of it.
That's so interesting. I recently recorded a podcast with Andy Evans, who's the CEO of Star of the South, who are putting together Australia's first offshore wind farm. So slightly different realm to you, but he is a reformed lawyer and talked quite a bit about the fact that, you know, he'd studied law, got to his mid to late 30s, not happy, not enjoying career, but because of external expectations, other people's expectations, ploughed on and continued with it, and then sort of got to this point where he had an epiphany and thought, well, why am I doing this? This does not make me happy. And it's so inspiring to hear people like the both of you talk about that and just sort of, you know, having this really inward focus about what makes you happy, and then you know, changing professional lives and focus such that you are focusing on what and what you love doing.
Yeah, no, it was an amazing time, and I did have my fears, of course, because you know, it was an area that I wasn't really familiar with. I only had a sense of it. And also at the time I was working in ANZ in the finance and performance analysis area, and some of the people in there were saying to me like, "Oh, why are you doing that?" and even at the time, I remember one of the senior people in the organisation said, "Oh, well, you're about to get a promotion. What are you doing?" I'm going,
yeah, okay.
Well, and I did toss back and forth, and I spoke to lots and lots of different people, and in the end, I just said, no, you need to listen to yourself, and that was I feel really proud that I did, because what I realised was until then I was just listening to everybody else and not myself.
Oh, well, I think everybody does that. Well, no, many people, or the majority of people do that. And if you're talking to people who had a similar background to you, then that's what they know and what they are familiar with. So if you're looking to sort of buck the trend and move in a different direction, there's probably an element of that that's a bit confronting and unfamiliar for them too, huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. Megumi, throughout the period you mentioned that you didn't fit the perfect model, and, you know, earlier in your career that you needed, or that you were behaving or needing to work in a way that was a bit inauthentic and as a bit less of an introvert, but that you now think quite differently. I'd love if you could talk us through that in a little bit more detail, please.
Sure, yeah. So I suppose when you say the perfect model, that it can be in different contexts. So it could be the perfect consultant, or what's perceived as the perfect consultant that looks really confident and, you know, at times arrogant, I find, which didn't sit well with me. The other thing is leaders as well. Generally speaking, we see leaders who are confident looking and outspoken and very articulate and all of that. So whichever way I looked, I felt like I didn't quite fit that model. Also in facilitation as well, as I said, I had all these extrovert colleagues who were very entertaining and you know, very engaging in a different way to me. So it took me a while to really find or work out what my model was, and it's not just about being an introvert either. It's also about, you know, things like me being the only Asian woman in a business context, for example. You know, I just didn't fit. So there was lots of things that I felt like I was in the minority all the time. So I think it was difficult to just find my way, my authentic way. And as I said earlier, at times when I tried to fit in, people would pick up the fact that I wasn't being authentic. So it was a difficult time. But I think as I moved towards working on Quietly Powerful, I started to really think about that. And it was soon after when I had that penny dropping moment that I shared. And I started to think, well, what do I need to do to really understand what I bring and what's different and what's uniquely valuable about the way that I do things?
Yes.
And it's in the context of facilitation, it's in the context of leadership, it's even in presenting. So I did have an incident where I presented to quite a large audience. It was probably about 70 or 80 senior leaders. And it was quite a surprise because at that time I was thinking, you know, how can I bring more of my approach to presenting? And some of the things that I tend to do, because I don't like being the centre of attention, is that I involve the group a lot more than what I've seen other people do.
Okay.
And so, I toss questions over to them. I get them talking to each other and those sort of things. And it is partially because I don't like being the centre of attention the whole time. I find that exhausting.
Sure. Yes.
But also because I do like hearing from other people as well. And something that happened after I presented to the group was the person who brought me in. She said to me, "Oh gosh, Megumi, you were so different, like opposite ends to the person that we had before." And you know, they have these leadership forums every month or so. And she said it was very, very different and very, very engaging, because you were so different, and she really appreciated it. And so I just thought, wow, it's working. You know, I did my own thing.
Damn it, look at me. So I have a hell of a lot of value to add, but just in a different approach.
So that was a real affirmation or positive reinforcement for me, because I was consciously thinking about how can I bring more of myself. So that was really helpful to start to build up my confidence in working my own way. And I started doing it more and more, and I got better and better feedback.
I love that story. I mean, it's also, you know, if I think about great presenters I've seen, a lot of them are really good at involving the audience, you know, albeit perhaps for a variety of reasons. You know, maybe more of them are, you know, introvert than perhaps might be obvious, but it's just so inspiring hearing the sort of way that you know, if I can say this without sounding remotely condescending, that you blossomed and increasingly found ways to present in a way that you were comfortable with and played to your strengths.
Yeah, definitely. No, it blossomed is a nice word.
Well, I don't want that to sound condescending, but it is the first word that sort of springs to mind.
Yeah, fair enough.
Talking about all these fabulous awakenings and becoming more confident with what you were doing.
Yeah.
You're clearly so passionate about what you're doing now, and you love the content and the work, but I have to say it seems deeply ironic that it means you're up in front of people presenting.
Oh, I know. I actually say that to people. I say that I don't like being the centre of attention. What on earth am I doing standing in front of hundreds of people? But I think the reason behind that, and I do talk about this in the work of Quietly Powerful, is that even if you don't like doing certain things or you're not comfortable with certain things, you can actually do it when there's a purpose behind it.
Sure.
And so I think that's, you know, you picked up on my passion. So that's where it comes from. And because I'm passionate, I will go beyond what I'm comfortable with or beyond something that I might normally do. And there's theories behind that. Psychologists talk about what's called the free trait theory. And that talks about when you are passionate, when you are committed to something bigger than yourself, you can absolutely do things that are out of your character, or, you know, out of your natural style, if you like.
I'm going to do a bit of research on that. That sounds really interesting. It was free trait
theory. I think it was Dr. Brian Little from memory.
Okay.
So he does a TED talk, and he's actually a very shy introvert, professor or lecturer,
Okay.
and he said that when he goes into lecturing things, he gets very animated because, again, he's very passionate about the topic.
I'm going to go check him out. He sounds really
Mm,
interesting.
mm, mm.
Megumi, there are different reasons that people can be quiet.
Mm.
What are some of the other reasons?
Yeah. So I think I find that people equate introversion with quiet, and that's a little bit limiting. That's just
Okay.
one of the reasons. So of course you can be quiet because you're introvert, but the whole thing about introversion that gets misunderstood is that introversion is about where you get your energy. So you get your energy from being on your own and being with your thoughts, versus extroverts get energy from being with other people. So that doesn't necessarily equate to being quiet all the time, in that I know lots of introvert presenters, professional speakers, comedians, actors, all those people who can be highly gregarious in front of a group. So it's not just that. There's other reasons too, like people who are very agreeable. So when you look at personality traits, people who are very accommodating and agreeable.
Yes.
So they don't like conflict, so they like to make sure everybody's happy. So they can go quiet because they don't want to disagree with people in front of a group. So, or they just avoid the conflict, so they just don't speak up about things. So that can be another reason. Another reason could be that they're quite anxious. So again, there's a personality trait that talks about high emotionality, or neuroticism is one of the psychology terms that they talk about. I suppose I don't use that terminology because it doesn't sound too good.
No.
It's just high emotionality is just about how intensely you feel situations, or situations that are around you. It's not so much how much you express it, but it's how intensely you feel. So you can be a very quiet, highly intensely feeling person, and that's often where you find people looking calm on the outside, but they're absolutely stressed out on the inside.
Sure.
And there's lots and lots of people like that.
Yes.
So that anxiety or that stress could cause people to go quiet, because they're anxious about what other people might think, or they might be really anxious about saying the wrong thing. So there's another personality trait that can contribute to being quieter. But there's lots of other reasons too, like just upbringing. So being brought up in a Japanese parents and Japanese, I did go to Japanese school for a little while. That can have an impact in terms of how you're supposed to behave.
Yes.
So in a Japanese culture, you're not supposed to disagree with the teachers, or raise your hand and say things. You're supposed to remain quiet, and that's supposed to be how students are, and you're not supposed to argue with your boss or disagree with your boss. So again, that could lead to people being quieter. And I know lots of, not just Japanese, but other Asian cultures are the same.
Well, and I know in Aboriginal culture, it's disrespectful to look somebody in the eye. And if you think about the Western philosophy, if you're not looking someone in the eye when you're talking about something, you can appear to be a bit shifty, or perhaps not telling the truth. I mean that is one other example that comes to mind.
Absolutely. So that upbringing can have an impact. And then I was talking about this Asian cultural context, and in one of the breakfasts, and one of the people raised their hand and said, "Oh, well, it's not just a cultural thing, it's also a religious thing." I go, "Oh, okay, here we go." And this person talked about, well, I was brought up a Catholic, and to be a really good Catholic girl, you had to be mild and meek and not say things. And so that was another one that came up. So again, it's upbringing and how you've been conditioned and brought up. And then the final thing too that I find interesting that happens is power dynamics in any context. So I'm sure you've seen in meetings when there's somebody really senior in a group that other people go quiet.
Yes.
Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
And they often look at that senior person to say something. And when people do speak, they'll say things that that senior person might want to hear. And that's not very helpful. But it does happen.
It does.
And so when people go quiet, it's not necessarily that they're they're naturally quiet, that they just go quiet because either out of respect or out of fear that they might get judged. And so, and even if there's not a senior person, the other times that you find this power dynamic is if you're, say, the only person with a certain idea. That can cause people to go quiet and go in hiding, if you like, because it's too dangerous to bring up a topic that's counter to what everybody else believes.
Which goes against the grain of one of the reasons why diversity is so important.
Definitely, but it's hard to achieve as well. So, in that context of diversity, what I found interesting too, like the whole debate about marriage equality back last year, and I'm really pleased that happened, and I love the fact that we're appreciating. So I'm more of that thought, but I was thinking 40% of Australians disagree with it, and imagine if we're having a conversation. So you obviously agree, I obviously agree, and let's say if we had a bunch of people who agree with marriage equality, and imagine if somebody walked in who's on the 40% side.
Yeah, how comfortable
it would be really difficult. Yeah, it would be really difficult. So I just think the challenge is that power dynamic. When you're in the mainstream, it's really easy to talk, but when you're in the minority in any context, it's really, really difficult to speak up. So they're all the various reasons. It's quite complex. I think
it is quite complex. You've certainly given me an enormous amount of food for thought there. Now, Megumi, before we finish up, we need to talk about your new book. I know that you are spending the next 2 or 3 weeks madly off all the final little pieces. Talk to us about your new book, please.
Yes, it is a book on Quietly Powerful. So I've already been talking about Quietly Powerful in this podcast, but I'm officially putting it down in a book. So that's exciting but scary. Scary because I've been talking about it, and when you're talking, the words just disappear into thin air.
Yes.
When you write it into a book, it doesn't disappear. So I have to be really not careful, but really think through what I'm putting down and make sure that it is what I want to say. So it's taking me a lot of time, effort, and brain space. As I said to you before, there's lots of things that, as I'm writing, there's lots of times that I find it really enjoyable, but there's lots of times when I go, oh my God, this is so hard. Why am I doing this?
What possessed me?
No, exactly. And I'd walk away and I'd think about it and go, oh my God, why am I doing this? I wish I was finished. But I'm on the whole, I'm still excited about it. I already have organised a book launch date and everything, which is really weird because I haven't even finished. But it'll be November.
Okay. And are you settled on a title?
Goes well. So the title is Quietly Powerful, and the subtitle I haven't quite settled on, but I think it'll be something like How Your Quiet Nature is Your Hidden Leadership Strength, or something along those lines. Yeah, so it is very much about helping quieter professionals to see the value of their quiet nature, but it's also about using the quiet nature in all of us in our leadership, because like we were saying before about burnout, there's a cost to not accessing our quieter nature, regardless of the personality and, type of person you are. There's also a real downside to not using our quiet nature in leadership, because there's so many things, like even just a simple act of listening and taking people's ideas into account that requires you to be a little quieter. And if you don't access that, there's so much downside to your leadership.
Well, it means that probably that you're being domineering and not taking advantage or making the most of all the smart, clever people around you.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you know that one person can't know everything. So
no, absolutely.
And especially in this world where things are changing and there's so much disruption and you need all these great ideas, one person can't have it all. You just need to be able to rely on other people and be able to come up with ideas together rather than on your own.
Absolutely. Megumi, I have so enjoyed our conversation. Thank you. As a sometimes rather loud extrovert, you have given me a huge amount to think about. I'm incredibly grateful. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I eagerly anticipate November when I can read Quietly Powerful. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Katie. I enjoyed it too.
It's been fantastic. And thanks for listening to the Katie Talks podcast with me, Katie Bennett-Stenton. If you enjoyed this episode, please review me on iTunes to help others find this great content. I have some excellent thought leaders coming up in the series. Subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. And I love feedback from listeners. You can find me at Katie B Marketing on Twitter or Katie Bennett-Stenton on LinkedIn.